The quorum of ascended worlds kept their records in light. Not metaphorically. The great archive of the Veil 3 consensus existed as a living lattice of photonic thread suspended in the vacuum between their twin moons. 300 million kilometers of encoded history. Every species ever contacted, every war ever logged, every civilization ever ranked and filed and forgotten. To actually walk through the archive was to walk through light itself, amber and violet, and the particular blue-white of a star going cold. Humanity occupied 47 threads. 47 out of a catalog that ran to the billions. Zelkorin, senior assessor of new contact species, pulled humanity's file the way you'd pick up something left on the floor, the gesture of a being performing a task beneath its station. The threads unwound lazily in front of their secondary visual receptors. A small rocky world, third orbital position, single yellow star, atmospheric composition unremarkable. Dominant species bipedal with a lifespan so brief it bordered on the insulting. Average natural lifespan, 70 to 90 standard rotations. Corin's membrane flickered, the Veil 3 equivalent of a dry laugh. 70 rotations, and the Veil 3 birthing cycle alone took 60. Whatever these creatures managed to accomplish inside a window that short, it couldn't be very much. The military assessment was even more dismissive. Humans had no natural venom, no armor plating, no regenerative capability. Their musculature was average at best. The Drovok beetles of Cetum Minor could lift 40 times their own body weight. Humans managed a fraction of that. Their sensory apparatus was almost comedically limited. They heard a narrow bandwidth of sound, saw only a sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, and possessed exactly zero capability for extrasensory patterning. What they did actually have, and the assessment flagged this as mildly anomalous, was pain tolerance. Humans experienced pain the way other tier 4 species experienced moderate discomfort. They ran on broken bones. They finished things bleeding, which one early contact report described a human who had been struck by a vehicle traveling at significant velocity, stood up, and apologized to the driver. The assessors had filed this under neurological deficiency, probable. The weapons technology was primitive enough to make Corin set the file down and look away for a moment. Ballistic projectiles, chemical propellants. The occasional crude, directed energy weapon that the Veil 3 had surpassed 8,000 rotations ago. Their starships were slow, graceless, and loud in ways that suggested their builders had never been genuinely afraid of what lived in the dark between stars. That last part, Corin noted, was probably because they didn't know yet. They hadn't encountered the Grath. Nobody stayed unafraid after they encountered the Grath. The Grath. Even writing the word in an official report required a small ritual of psychological bracing among veteran assessors. The file for the Grath ran to 4 million threads in the archive, and most of it was damage reports. They weren't kind of a civilization in any sense the Veil 3 recognized. They weren't a species, exactly. They were something evolution had produced by accident, and then doubled down on, a decision the universe had clearly made while drunk. Each Grath individual massed between 6 and 12 tons depending on age and caste. Their exoskeletal armor had stopped high-yield plasma rounds in documented combat. They had no apparent fear response. Neurological scans taken from deceased specimens showed the amygdaloid equivalent simply absent, the way a house might be missing a room that was never built. They communicated through subsonic vibration that passed through solid matter. They worked through it by sensing the magnetic distortion of gravitational bodies. They hunted by body heat, by pressure displacement, by the electrical signature of a beating heart. They couldn't be negotiated with. 43 species had tried. They couldn't be domesticated. The Veil 3 scientific community had formally declared this an impossibility after 7 catastrophic attempts. The Draenei had tried. The collective of Mun had tried. The Seshti matriarchy had committed an entire century of research to the question before abandoning it in the wake of what the records called the Seshti incident and what surviving witnesses called something unrepeatable in polite company. A juvenile Grath, a creature still too young to reproduce, not yet fully armored, standing a modest 4 meters at the shoulder, had been captured during the Contested Reaches campaign and was being transported aboard a Veil 3 research vessel toward a containment facility. They had used 11 separate restraint systems. It had taken the ship apart from the inside before they'd cleared the debris field. The formal military assessment of the graph. Apex predator, uncontainable. Recommended response. Avoidance at minimum safe distance of 40 Australian dollars. Under no circumstances permit contact with non-combatant populations. All TBH of this is context. All of this is important. Because when the Grath arrived at Settler Station Yeva 9, a human colonial outpost on the frontier of what the Veil 3 hadn't yet gotten around to claiming, staffed by 1,100 humans and exactly 0 military personnel, the Veil 3 response fleet was 22 hours away. And a 7-year-old girl named Marin Solis was eating breakfast. The emergency klaxon sort of started at 0614 station time, which was, Marin felt, very rude. She had just gotten to the good part of her oatmeal. The ratio of synthetic cinnamon to reconstituted apple was finally, right? And the bowl went skidding across the table when her mother grabbed her arm and pulled. Mama, now, Marin. Her mother's voice did the thing it only did twice before in Marin's memory. The time the pressure seal on Havelock C had failed, and the night her father hadn't come back from the outer relay check. It went flat. Not calm flat. Like something behind it had been hammered down hard. Marin left the oatmeal. The station's emergency broadcast was terse in the way all Veil 3 format alerts were terse. Their translation AIs stripped warmth from language as a default setting. So what came through the speakers sounded like a machine informing you of your own funeral arrangements. Unidentified apex organism. Breach of outer perimeter. All non-essential personnel proceed to interior shelter zones. Veil 3 response fleet. Estimated arrival 22.4 standard hours. 22 hours. Commander Benedetta Osei heard that number and felt it land somewhere below her ribs. She was standing in the station's operations center, 43 years old, built like someone who had spent 20 years making the galaxy behave, and she was running the math on 1,100 people and a 22-hour window. What class? She asked Specialist Tan without looking up from the tactical display. Tan's voice had gone small. The Veil 3 sensor package is calling it a juvenile graph, Commander. But the mass reading a pause. It's not juvenile. On the display, the thermal signature was the color of a small sun. Locke looked down the outer ring. Get everyone into the deep interior. Seal every blast door weave. The blast doors won't, I know that, Tan. She said it without heat. Just a woman knowing a true thing. TBH, seal them anyway. Plus it buys time. Time is what we're selling right now. The station went into lockdown. And honestly, Hab Block D, 40 meters from Marin's family's unit, a storage loader named Deshaun Okafor was helping seal a pressure door when it occurred to him that he could hear something. Not through the speakers, not through the walls, which through his feet. A vibration, so low it wasn't quite sound, traveling up through the decking. Into the bones, I guess, of his legs, a frequency that his brain processed about half a second before his spine did. His spine's verdict was unambiguous. Run. His brain was still working on it when the outer wall of Corridor 7 simply ceased to exist. If for what it's worth, move the way large things weren't supposed to move, the way a nightmare moves, with the obscene fluency of something that had never, I think, once in its evolutionary history, needed to be careful about anything. It came through the wall like the wall was an opinion it disagreed with. It stood in the rupture in the dim emergency lighting, and it was enormous in ways that measurements couldn't quite capture. Commander Osei watched it on the tactical feed. She had seen Grath in briefing files. She had studied the combat logs. She had, with the methodical thoroughness that had gotten her this command, prepared herself for this possibility the way you prepared for a thing you hoped would never happen. She wasn't prepared. Nothing in the briefings had conveyed the quality of the stillness. It had, standing inside the breach. The way it TBH seemed to be tasting the air with its entire body. The way the emergency lighting changed around it, as if the station's own photons were trying to get out of the way. She keyed the broadband intercom, and all personnel, this is Commander Osei. I need everyone to stay completely still and completely silent. No movement, no sound. She breathed once. The Grath hunts by motion and bioelectrical signature. If it cannot locate you, it won't chase you. Stay still. In the deep interior, in the emergency shelter of Hab Block B, 1,100 people heard this and tried to become furniture. Marin's mother pulled her daughter into the corner of the shelter, arms around her, face pressed into the top of Marin's head. She was doing the flat voice thing again, except now it was her whole body doing it. Every muscle hammered down, held in. Marin stayed still. She was pretty much good still. Her father had taught her that. He'd been a surveyor, spent months in habitats where sound carried wrong and patience was the only tool. He made a game of it. Who can be quieter than the vacuum, Marin? She was very good at the game. What she was less good at wasn't being curious. The shelter door was sealed but not locked. A protocol failure later, one of many things reviewed. Marin, after 4 minutes of perfect stillness, did the thing that 7-year-olds do. She looked. Pretty much just a crack. Just a sliver. The corridor outside was dark except for the red emergency strips along the floor, and for a moment she saw nothing, and she thought maybe it had gone another way, maybe the commander's plan was working. The Grath was in the corridor. It was 15 feet away, and it was enormous, and it was sniffing the air with a motion that traveled the entire length of its body like a wave. Marin watched it with the particular quality of attention that children have for things that are new and impossible and too large to be real. Her mother's hand came around the door, slow and desperate to pull it shut. The motion was minimal. It was enough, and the Grath's head turned. Marin felt the sound it made. Not heard fell in her back teeth and her sternum and somewhere deep in the part of her brain responsible for very old fears. And it moved, to be fair, toward the shelter. Toward her. The deck shuddered under each footfall. It was almost at the door, and Marin Solis looked at the most dangerous thing in 14-star systems and said, "Sit." Fun fact, she said it the way her father had taught her to say it to the station service dogs. I mean firmly. Like she meant it. Plus, like she'd already decided how this was going to go. Not loud. Not panicked. Not a plea. A word delivered with the calm authority of someone who wasn't interested in alternatives. To be fair, Sit. The Grath stopped. The silence afterward was the kind that happens when a very loud thing turns off, the kind of silence that has a shape. It tilted its enormous head. The motion was slow, and it was strange, and it was the most frightening thing Marin had ever seen, and she stood in the cracked door and held its gaze the way her father had told her to do with the dogs. Don't look away, baby. They need to know you're not scared. She was terrified. She didn't look away. TBH, 3 seconds. 5. 10. The Grath sat. Not all the way. It was a posture more than a position, a lowering of the massive anterior body toward the deck, a shift in weight that traveled through the floor in a frequency Marin felt behind her kneecaps. But it sat. It settled. The appalling restlessness, I guess, of it, the coiled readiness she'd felt through the walls, through the air, through her own heartbeat, shifted into something else. Something that took her another 3 seconds to name. Stillness. It was watching her. She was watching it, which Marin Solis, 7 years old, daughter of a dead surveyor, and a very brave woman, looked at the thing that had broken the station like a cereal box and said for the second time, with the same authority, "Good." Commander Osei watched this on the tactical feed with her hand on the emergency broadcast button and her finger not pressing it. Next to her, Specialist Tan had stopped breathing sometime in the last 30 seconds. I guess he started again. "Commander, don't. Commander, I see it, Tan. Don't touch anything." On the feed, the girl and the creature sat in the red-lit corridor and looked at each other. The Grath didn't move. Part 3. The thing they filed wrong, the Veil 3 response fleet arrived 19 hours and 41 minutes early. Not because they flew faster, and because Commander Osei's emergency broadcast, transmitting at maximum power, encrypted to every Veil 3 military channel in range. Using language she'd specifically chosen to make a Veil 3 assessor's membrane curl with dread, had described the situation in terms the fleet admiral couldn't ignore. Juvenile Grath on station. Non-combatant population 1100, and request immediate assistance. What it hadn't said, because Osei had understood that saying it would be received as either a lie or a malfunction, was this: Juvenile Grath on station. Under control. Request immediate assistance of different variety. Fleet Admiral Veil 3 Sin Orith brought 3 warships and a containment specialist vessel out of transit. Expected, with the particular tired resignation of a commander who had lost ships to Grath before to find debris. What they found was a station, mostly intact. What they found on the secondary internal sensors was a thermal signature so large it made the tactical display struggle. A graph, adult class, settled in the main corridor of HAB Block D, surrounded by 47 humans who had apparently decided that the appropriate response to being in the same room as the most dangerous organism in explored space was to sit on the floor and wait to see what happened. In the center of this arrangement, a small human child. Not small by, I guess, Veil 3 standards. All humans were small by Veil 3 standards. Small by human standards, which half the height of the adult around her. Sitting cross-legged 3 meters from the graph with a piece of food in her hand. Later analysis would identify it as a nutrient bar of some kind, synthetic grain, the type that came in emergency ration kits, offering it. The graph wasn't eating the food. The graph was watching the child with something that the Veil 3 containment specialists, reviewing the sensor logs later, would describe in their official report as attentive stillness and then amend to unknown behavioral state. No existing classification. Admiral Orth stared at the feed for a long time. Then, they said, with the particular flatness of a being whose worldview is being quietly disassembled. "Get me Commander Osei." Osei's face appeared on the comm screen. She looked like kind of someone who hadn't slept in 19 hours, which was because she hadn't slept in 19 hours. She looked pretty much also like someone who had come out the other side of something and was still taking stock of her hands to see if they were shaking. They weren't shaking. "Which Commander Osei? Explain what I'm looking at." "The graph has been calm for approximately 16 hours, Admiral. It hasn't moved from that corridor. It hasn't. It hasn't engaged any personnel. We've had 7 people walk past it at various points, and it..." Osei paused. "It watches them. The child. Her name is Marin Solis. She's sort of 7. She commanded the graph to be still. She told it to sit." Osei said this simply, like she was giving a report. "It's Saturday." The silence on the channel was the kind that accumulates weight. "Commander," the Admiral said, "we've 17 documented attempts by Tier 6 and Tier 7 species with advanced neurological interface technology, phenomenal pacification systems, directed sonic suppression to control graph behavior. All 17 ended in what I'll describe as significant structural and personnel loss." "Yes, sir." A human child told it to sit. "Yes, sir." Another silence. The Admiral's secondary, actually visual receptors flickered in what Osei had learned. In 3 years of Veil 3 contact, was a gesture that meant something between "I'm reconsidering my assumptions" and "I need to lie down." "How?" said Admiral Orth. "Did she know to do that?" Osei almost smiled. "Almost. She didn't know to do anything, Admiral. She grew up with dogs. We have working animals on the station. She's, I guess, been trained since she could walk to speak to large animals with calm authority." Osei looked at the feed. Marin was still sitting there, small and cross-legged, the nutrient bar still extended. She didn't know the graph was supposed to be impossible. She actually just saw a large animal, and she did what her father taught her. On the feed, the graph made the low, subsonic vibration that passed through every surface in the corridor, through the decking, through the hull, through the vacuum, all the way to the fleet ships 20 kilometers out, where every sensor array pinged with it. Marin Solis didn't flinch. She kind of said, "Good boy." The Veil 3 containment specialists spent 4 days on Yeva 9 before filing their preliminary report. Senior specialist Devrakian, who had dedicated her professional life to graph behavior and had lost 2 colleagues to a containment breach 6 rotations prior, sat in the station's observation bay with Commander Osei on the final evening and watched Marin through the viewport. Marin was in the corridor. The graph was there. She was talking to it, a steady, low narration that Devrakian couldn't fully translate because the language processing kept flagging the register as non-standard, possibly juvenile dialect, and the graph was doing the thing it had been doing for 4 days, which was staying very still and watching her with an intensity that Devrakian had previously only seen graph direct to things they were about to destroy. "The behavior doesn't match any existing graph profile," Devrakian said, not for the first time. "No," said Osei. "The closest analog in our records is imprinting behavior. But graph don't imprint. We've established this across 700 rotations of study. Apparently you established it across 700 rotations of study that didn't include a 7-year-old who grew up around working dogs and doesn't know what impossible means. Devrikian was quiet for a moment. What did her father do? Surveyor. Plus, ou relais. He went out to repair a comm array 8 months ago and didn't come back. Osei watched the small figure in the corridor. She's been a pause, a word happening below the surface, and not quite coming up. She's been very contained about it. Her mother says she doesn't talk about it. She just does things. Takes care of the station dogs. Helps with the younger kids in the shelter block. Devrikian processed this. She displaced the grief onto caretaking behavior. She's 7. I don't know that she'd use that word. Osei looked at her hands. I think she misses her dad. And she takes care of things. Because that's what he taught her. She nodded toward the viewport. That thing out there, and it's the size of a building, and it's been emptying entire planets for 300 rotations, and she sat in front of it and offered it a nutrient bar. Because she wasn't afraid. Because she was afraid and did it anyway. Osei corrected this quietly, like the difference mattered. That's the thing you keep filing wrong about us, Admiral. You keep seeing the fear tolerance and calling it a neurological deficiency. It's not. She looked at the Veil 3 specialist. Fear is information. We get the information. We decide what to do with it after. Devrikian's membrane was very still. Your 47 threads, she said. What? In the archive, which humanity has 47 threads. A pause. I authorized the expansion this morning. We are currently at approximately 4,000 and climbing. The assessment team. Some of them are arguing for a tier reclassification. Another pause. There's significant disagreement about which direction. In the corridor, Marin Solis said something to the graph, and it made the subsonic vibration again. Lower this time, longer, the kind that didn't feel like threat, and didn't quite feel like anything the specialist had a word for. Devrikian watched it, and felt the professional ground under her feet do something it had never done before. Shift. The formal incident report filed by Admiral Veil 3 Sin Orith on the matter of Settler Station Yeva 9 ran to 11,000 lines of photonic thread in the archive. Most of it was damage assessment, personnel accounts, structural integrity reports. The last section TBH was added by the Admiral personally, which was unusual. Admirals delegated conclusions. Plus, Orith didn't in this case. It read, the human behavioral trait that most consistently defies Veil 3 predictive modeling isn't their pain tolerance, their tactical creativity, or their documented capacity for cooperative sacrifice under duress, though all of these warrant really revised assessment. It is this. Humans don't require understanding of a situation before they act within it. Every species pretty much, in the quorum, requires some threshold of threat assessment, behavioral classification, and probability mapping before engaging an unknown organism. This is rational. This is how intelligence protects itself. Humans bypass this sequence. Not from ignorance. Human cognitive processing is proved to be thorough and adaptive. They bypass it because they appear to have determined, somewhere in their evolutionary history, that waiting for certainty is a luxury that their brief lives cannot afford. They assess while they act. Marin Solis didn't know the graph could be communicated with. 17 Tier 6 and Tier 7 species didn't know this either, and they had research programs of centuries to not know it with. She didn't wait to know it, and she applied what she understood, large animal, agitated state, calm authority required, to a situation that no existing framework covered, and it worked. I filed this incident under the designation First Contact Category Emergent. Category Emergent. A contact event that reveals not new information about the contacted species, but new information about the species making contact. We have been in contact with humanity for 63 standard rotations. I'm recommending we begin again. Veil 3 Sin Orith, Fleet Admiral. Contested reaches Command Marin Solis left Yeva 9 6 weeks later, aboard a Veil 3 transport vessel. One of 4 ships that came for the station's population when it was determined the structural damage was beyond economic repair. She left last. Not because anyone told her to, because she was in the corridor. Her mother found her there on the final morning, sitting cross-legged in front of the graph, which was being transported separately to what the Veil 3 specialists were now carefully calling a behavioral study environment rather than a containment facility, because it had become apparent that language mattered when you were classifying something whose behavior didn't fit existing classifications. Maren was, I think, talking to it. The low, steady narration that had run for 6 weeks. Her mother stood in the corridor doorway and listened. "Up to go now," Maren was saying. "Plus, you're going to go somewhere else. There's going to be people there, and they're going to study you, which is kind of like school, except nobody has to raise their hand." She paused. "Honestly, be good. Don't break things. I mean, try." Another pause. "Dad says actually, when you have to be somewhere new, you just look for one thing that feels okay, and you start there." She stood up. The graph made the subsonic vibration that didn't have a name yet. Maren put her hand, briefly, on the armor plating of the graph's anterior section. A patch of surface just below and to the left of what might be called a head, if you were being generous about the architecture. "Good boy," she said. Then she turned and walked to her mother and took her hand and didn't look back. Her mother looked back. The graph was watching them go. The graph didn't move. Senior Assessor Zalcorn of the Veil 3 archive pulled Humanities file 3 months after the Yeva 9 incident, not because the reassessment was complete, but because they couldn't stop thinking about it. 47 threads had become 600,000. They stood in the amber and violet light of the archive and read the incident reports and the behavioral analysis and the Admiral's addendum and the preliminary tier reclassification arguments and the sub-arguments and the counter-arguments and the very unusual formal dissent filed by Devrakian, who had written, against all protocol, a 1-sentence addendum to her own report. "I believe we've been, for 63 standard rotations, mildly afraid of the wrong species." Corin stood in the light of 600,000 threads, 70 rotations, and a lifespan shorter than a Veil 3 adolescence. A species with no venom, no armor, no sensory range beyond the narrow band of the visible. A species that showed up to the vast, indifferent darkness of the universe with working dogs and nutrient bars and children who had learned from their dead fathers how to speak with calm authority to things that could eat them. A species that had looked at the graph 43 civilizations nightmare, the apex predator that evolution had produced, and then refused to stop the thing that dismantled warships as an afterthought, and said sit. And well, the graph had sat, not because of technology, not because of pheromones or sonic suppression or neurological interface, because a small human child, grief-carrying and unafraid in all the ways that weren't really unafraid, had decided that large animals needed calm authority, had supplied it from a place so internally certain that even a creature with no capacity for submission had somehow received the transmission. What are you, Corin thought? What, to be fair, are you that the universe keeps not killing you, that you keep arriving in impossible situations with nothing but what you were taught by someone who loved you, and you keep just the archive hummed around them. 600,000 threads and climbing. Corin filed the reassessment. In the field marked primary species designation, they deleted tier for sentient, manageable. They left the field blank. The form required an entry. It would flag without one. They sat TBH with the blankness for a while. Then they typed classification pending. Assessment, ongoing, recommendation. Do not underestimate. They considered that last line, which they left it, somewhere in the Veil 3 contested reaches, in a behavioral study environment. That was already 3 times the original containment budget, and would eventually become its own subfield of xenobiology, a graph paste. Every assessor on the project noted the same anomaly in their reports. It paced toward the door. It waited. Then it paced back, pretty much toward the door. Back. Actually, every 12 hours approximately. The behavioral team classified this eventually, after 6 months of study, under a category they had to invent: anticipatory social behavior. They sent Maren Solis a message through Commander Osei, through the Human Colonial Relay Network, to wherever she had been resettled. The message asked if she would be willing to consult. She was 8 by then,